Hello, I'm Dale Gentry, and this is the Disciple Science Podcast. Today we're going to speak with Greg Cootsona, who teaches in the Department of Comparative Religion and Humanities at California State University at Chico. Greg directs Science for the Church, a project designed to bring the resources of science to strengthen congregational life. From 2016 to early 2019, he directed the Science and Theology for Emerging Adult Ministries at Fuller Seminary. Greg served as a pastor for 18 years, and he's published on numerous topics, recently focusing on the intersection of science and faith. He's authored the book Mere Science and Christian Faith, Bridging the Divide with Emerging Adults, which is published in 2018 by InterVarsity Press, and his book Negotiating Science and Religion in America, Past, Present, and Future, will be published by Routledge Press next month. Greg also serves as an advisor to Biologos, Dozier Program, which is the dialogue on science, ethics, and religion from the American Academy for the Advancement of Science, Sinai and Synapses, and the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences. Greg, welcome to the Disciple Science Podcast.
I'm glad to be part of it. Thanks for inviting me.
Sure. So for the past few weeks, we've been talking about some of the tension between science and faith, primarily from a historical perspective. And today we're really fortunate to have you on to address this from a more modern angle. Now, from your background, it appears that you weren't always interested in this topic. You've studied and taught on a number of different issues. What got you interested in the intersection of science and faith?
It's true that I wasn't always interested in this topic, for sure, Dale. And part of it was I wasn't always interested in the gospel. So it might take me a minute or two, but I can tell you how I got to be interested in both the gospel and in science and faith.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So this is sort of a punchline. I grew up in a secular household. I went to UC Berkeley and I became a Christian. That should sound a little odd.
Yeah.
I grew up in what we would now call in a household of nuns, no religious affiliation.
Sure.
And that was in the Bay Area in what's, I think, most often, in terms of surveys, seen as the least religious environment in our country. So, around it's what's now Silicon Valley and so on. It wasn't quite Silicon Valley when I was growing up there.
Just the start, right? Yeah.
Just the start, yeah. Wozniak and Jobs created the personal computer, like 5 miles from my house. But anyway, it was kind of beginning when I was in high school and stuff. Yeah. I went to Berkeley and encountered the gospel. And in my second quarter, I became a Christian, really being, more than anything else, just bowled over by the person of Jesus and the message of Jesus. So I grew up with an engineer father, and he was always interested in what would work. What was the science behind, let's say, whether glasses, like glasses you drink out of, would be stable or unstable. And I remember he particularly didn't like the old Coke glasses that were thicker at the top or wider at the top, because that would be unstable.
Yeah, bad design, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It had a high center of gravity.
Right.
So I learned science through him. I mean, he was a person who, from an engineering perspective, but in applied science, you might say, really, tried to work to think out things rationally and in terms of things that could be tested. So I didn't have a negative view of science. I like science, although I've always been drawn more to the humanities. Yep. And yet, when I first became a Christian at Berkeley, there were many atheist professors and students who maybe were formerly part of the church. I can think of a couple particularly that come to mind who were no longer Christians, and other kinds of people who were testing my faith and using science as a key voice for why Christianity was outdated. Let me add to that, I was also living in a fraternity when I became a Christian, so not only were there intellectual challenges, but there were some ethical ones as well. Yeah. So it was really, so it's this dual thing. It's like I was very excited about my faith. C.S. Lewis was incredibly important in becoming a Christian, and continues to be important to me. And so he had this tremendous sense that the gospel was robust and could engage contemporary issues. So that side, I was positive about science, but then I also heard the atheists and naturalists saying, "Oh man, Christianity is outmoded. Science and technology have made it so. How can you still believe?" And so part of it also was the defensive side. Like, I got to figure out how to do this. I'm kind of gangling adolescent in my faith, but these people are top notch, and I need to figure it out.
So so you went in to be a pastor, is that right? First?
Yes, yeah. So because I became a Christian as an 18-year-old, and although I felt a calling to become look into being a church leader, as it were, it took me I think it's 10 years before I was ordained.
Wow.
And in that process, also in my theological training, I began to get more engaged in the precision that science offers us. And then when I eventually did a PhD, I went to the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, and their Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences is really amazing. And that's where I particularly learned this engagement with science and faith. So, so that's would probably be the more formal aspect of this engagement for me.
Yep.
It comes from the theological side, not from the scientific side.
Yeah.
And try to see in what ways science can be, not only a challenge, which it is sometimes, but also mainly a contributor to how we understand Scripture, how we understand Jesus, how we understand our relationship with God.
Yep.
So it was after my PhD in 1996 that I first started serving as a pastor, a Presbyterian pastor in Midtown Manhattan.
Wow. Oh, wow. What a cool story.
Yeah, it was really fun. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. So you got a really unique perspective with some time in ministry and churches and some time in universities and as a scholar. And in your writing, you do a great job of talking about how society and the scholarly world see the intersection between science and faith differently. Can you explain to us why that is?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I think, Dale, you might, if I'm understanding the inference from the book, it's that in the popular imagination, most people think that science and religion are in conflict.
Yeah, right.
There's a conflict out there, as it were. The statistics are somewhere around 70% of Americans say. Well, one particular survey is replicated in other surveys. It was done in 2013, I believe, and by Kyle Longest and Christian Smith. And they asked people to finish a statement which said, "The teachings of science and religion ultimately conflict." Agree, disagree, strongly disagree. And in the agree or strongly agree category, 70%, so 7 out of 10 people said they ultimately conflict. So that's the perception that's so much out there is, you can't bring these two together. And so when I started looking at this, especially in this last book, I've been working on negotiating science and religion in America. I recognized that this particular idea was promoted, especially in the late 19th century, by William Draper and Andrew Dixon White in two very prominent books, and that it's not really sustainable historically. I'm not saying there haven't been conflicts, but most historians, like Lawrence Principe at Johns Hopkins as one of the examples, but many others, would point out that it was a kind of polemic that was presented, but that has had a lot. So it hasn't had much traction in terms of historians and philosophers of science, but it has an incredible amount of traction in terms of our popular culture.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if I may add something to that, if you don't mind, I did a survey a few years back of how emerging adults, those people who are 18 to 30, how they come to their ideas about religion and science and where they'd look for answers. And so I think in the past, a lot of people, the past meaning, let's say 40, 50 years ago, a lot of people would try to find answers about religion, going to their pastor, their priest, their rabbi, etc. Most people today, according to the research that I've done, especially if they're not in the church, but even in the church, would go to the internet for finding answers. And as you know, the internet rewards people who are kind of brash and
Yep.
Not necessarily well informed. And
Yep.
in some ways, the less informed you are, the more you can be brash. And so, if you've gotten your information from the internet, you hear people who are kind of loudmouths and who like to make quips about somebody else, often mean ones. And so that's another, I think, way that more recently people are getting this conflict or warfare idea in their minds.
Yeah. So you're saying clickbait is to blame for our modern failure to understand the compatibility.
I think that's right. Yeah, I do. Yeah.
That's really interesting. So yeah, your book, focusing on young adults, it did seem that they have a different perception then of the intersection of science and faith from I guess older adults. Tell us what you found from that work.
Yeah, I mean, I continued doing some research in some of these really top sociologists like Elaine Howard Eklund and Christopher Scheidel, with who she also worked, in just trying to go further and deeper into the mindset of 18 to 30-year-olds. And it seems like there's a shift that's occurring. I mean, let me say one thing that actually seems to be replicated throughout different age demographics is that even if most people think there's a conflict, you might say, out there between religion and science, the same amount of people don't feel that there's a conflict with their own religious, spiritual commitments. So it's really interesting. The conflict for many people seems to be out there, but not in here. If that
yeah.
I think with emerging adults, and by emerging adults, it's this designation that's been developed since about the year 2000 that Jeffrey Arnett presented it, and it's the idea of adulthood is taking longer to emerge for people.
Yeah, right.
Primarily because people are marrying later and having children later than in the past. So with the emerging adult demographic, my experience is that there's less conflict. There's a really less conflict than the general population. There's a kind of a fatigue with the culture wars. There's an interest for people to see people who are leaders in science and religion learn how to get along, if not even reconcile their ideas in some ways. And I think overall, there's some of the topics of the past have become less important to emerging adults than they were maybe when I was doing my studies in the late 80s and early 90s.
Yep. Yeah, I was really taken by that. So I'm a biologist and
right, yeah.
Teach at a Christian university. And so we do deal with the origins debate a lot. And I was surprised to hear in your book that it seems like emerging adults are less interested in that than they are in other topics. Why is that? Yeah.
I mean, I know you sent me this question beforehand, and I pondered it a little bit to make sure I'm answering in a way that's thoughtful, to be honest.
Yeah.
Because some of it is the experience I've had in these, and I guess it's the last 5 years I've done, these large-ish projects of bringing science and faith to emerging adults. And part of it's anecdotal, as I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
So it's partly just an experience as I talk with, say, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship leaders or campus pastors or that sort of thing, that kind of person. The issue of origins is not as big. It doesn't loom as large as it might have, again, back in let's just say the 80s. And let me just say, I have older friends who are older who say in the 70s, the evangelical church wasn't really into the origins debate as strong as they were later,
interesting.
Which is really interesting. And that one I haven't sorted out. I haven't done my, the research on, but it's just an interesting statement. I mean, partly I think, Dale, it's that we are seeing some new topics emerge.
Right.
So I think technology like AI, artificial intelligence, transhumanism, whether devices will expand our human capabilities. I mean, even like a cell phone or a smartphone, whatever. Questions of climate change, questions of sexuality and sexual identity, and how these all relate to science are taking more prominence. And so I'm not seeing as much about the origins debate. That doesn't mean to say there isn't still a very rigorous debate about that. But my experience is that it's decreasing in terms of the heat, as you might say.
Yep.
maybe I could point to two surveys that I did think about. One was done by Elaine Howard Eklund at Rice, and I'll just make one more promo for her. She's really the best commentator and sociologist from the sociological social science perspective on science and religion. And she did some work on if you take, I think her book, it was a book that I was on that I helped a team that helped her on, we read it and engaged with her on it. And it's coming out, I think, in a couple months. But anyway, she recognized that if you give people not just a kind of binary, is the earth old, is it young, or whatever, but give them nuance, and you say, how committed are you to one of these positions? I'm paraphrasing here.
Yep.
People don't really land on one position. They have a number of positions that they could entertain. And so most Christians they really want God to be involved. That's their biggest issue. So if it sounds like the young earth position makes God more involved or retains God's involvement, that works for them. But they're not necessarily committed, in terms of what Elaine's found, to any one age. And my own, again, anecdotal experiences, many people will say, oh yeah, I could see the days of Genesis 1 being periods of time, which actually is a legitimate translation of the Hebrew word for day. And they're okay with that, And then there has been also this recent work that I believe it was the Pew Research Center did, where instead of asking just one question, they asked a number of questions about origins, and they found, in other words, it became a tree. You know what I mean? Like, you ask one question, you have a second question that follows it up, and gave greater nuance to the origins debate. And a strikingly lower percentage of people were young earth creationists if you asked them, follow-up questions, essentially, instead of just, again, a binary opposition of, is the earth, made by God and old or young, or is it, revolve over millions of years or whatever, billions of years. So those two surveys give some indication that things, I think, are shifting for Americans.
Now, could it be, is there any, I don't know if Elaine has studied it. And speaking of which, she was just here in Minnesota about a month ago and gave a talk at the University of Minnesota. It was fantastic.
Oh, good. Yeah, she's a great person to.
Yeah. Yep.
I can make a plug for any of your listeners. Like, find one of her YouTube videos or something. It's really worth hearing what she has to say. Yeah,
and a great speaker too. So, it makes me wonder if we're just seeing any of the fruit of the last few decades of helping people to see this. And it seems like the issues that are hot now that you mentioned, technology and whatnot, that we're moving beyond if science and faith can interact, and it's more how and the ethics of it, as opposed to just, do we have to keep these in separate compartments? Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think that's a great assessment, Dale. Yeah. And this book that John Evans just wrote, he's a University of California, San Diego sociologist, where he argues that really the issues are ethical more than conceptual, or epistemic, if you will. It's not about what we know; it's about what's going to change our lives. Can I give you one little pull out on that, or do you want to?
Yeah, please do.
Because to me, this is when I read Evans's book, it really changed my thinking, or it clarified what maybe I had been feeling, but I didn't really know how to discuss.
Right. Yeah.
So, like, if you go back to the Scopes trial in 1925, as I said, I've been working on a lot of history as I was doing this book I just finished, and it was not really primarily about the Scopes trial was John Scopes was brought forward as a person who was teaching evolution against the Tennessee law. And the Butler Act in 1925 that made it illegal for public schools to teach evolution. Yeah. So that was the trial, had huge publicity. William Jennings Bryan and it's Clarence Darrow, right? Yeah, went up against each other, and it was interesting. Bryan, who was a liberal, politically liberal, theologically conservative Christian, resisted the book that was brought forward, which was Hunter's Civic Biology, because Hunter had very clear eugenicist passages, things that would say, we breed animals so that the stronger, are the ones we want to continue their lineage, and we should do the same thing with human beings. I mean, that was in the book, that was under scrutiny by this law. And I'm not saying I agree with the law. I'm just saying that was what was concerning the ethics of evolution, which was leading to social Darwinism. And moving away from Christian compassion. And so when Brian went up against that, he was more concerned probably about the ethics than about like the epistemic, knowledge of evolution. Meaning, it wasn't so much for him. He didn't want us to be derived from apes, or evolved from apes, but he wasn't so concerned about the age of the earth at all. He was an old earth creationist. But even more was about, is evolution going to be used to support social Darwinism, which will get in the way of caring for the weak and the poor and the marginalized? So, in other words, ethics has been huge and continues to be huge.
That's a really interesting insight, because that's I think people have a caricature of that Scopes trial of it just being pure science versus scripture, and what a fascinating vision of what's behind their impetus for bringing it to court.
And it kind of blew me away, actually, because the good guys became the bad guys, or whatever. They became much more gray, I guess. And again, just if you don't mind, for your listeners, I like to give little ideas of places to go if you want to hear more. There's a really fabulous PBS special called Dichotomies in Dayton. Dayton was where the trial happened, by Lee Camp and his team. Dichotomies in Dayton, and they do some wonderful work on uncovering the history around. It's actually shot in the courtroom where the Scopes trial occurred. They did some great work on uncovering the history around the Scopes trial, and then of course Edward Larson's book Summer for the Gods, I think it is. Is just amazing. So some really good work has been done on that, but it kind of blows your categories out of the water a little bit, or my category.
Yeah. Well, it seems like there's so much truth to that in almost all of the famous stories of science versus faith. When you dig into the great historians that are writing on this topic, they say it's never nearly as simple as we make it out to be. Galileo, the scientist, and who was fighting against the Catholic Church, until we find that Galileo was a powerful professing Catholic, and the debate was probably less scripture versus science than it was personalities and Galileo's abrasiveness versus the church that needed to maybe feel like they had to put him in his place a little bit. But
I think you're absolutely right about that. And you were saying you've done some work with the history of science, which I think is really helpful for people as they set science and religion, and where they helpful for us to understand where we set ourselves today.
Yeah, for sure. I think it has certainly enlightened me in how nuanced the intersection was. When science first emerged, there really was very little conflict, and it wasn't until much later that things started to pop up. But that's a topic for another conversation.
Well, if I could I'll just put one little footnote there. Almost nobody is going to say that the Bible today, almost no conservative Christian, no Bible-believing Christian is going to say that the Bible teaches that the sun revolves around the earth.
Right, yeah, exactly.
But, there were people who were really concerned about whether Scripture taught that or not. And so we can get caught into patterns that aren't even really biblical, right? And that's what troubles me is, are we preventing people from believing because we're presenting bad science along with our the way we talk about the gospel? Yeah.
Well, maybe that's a good time to transition. How can we? I'm sure there are parents out there and teachers that want to know how they can talk to their kids or their students, or maybe even only think about it themselves. How can we better present both scripture and science so that we don't perpetuate this conflict? I don't want to call it a myth, but I think of it as a myth. But how do we prevent that in the future?
Yeah. Well, we need more people like you, Dale. People who understand the science well and integrate it with a robust faith. I think that's a really important thing. I actually also think that pastors and Christian leaders are really important. I read a great article, actually a short book by Jonathan Hill. I was a sociologist at Calvin College, and it said that what a pastor thinks is probably, vastly more important than what a professor thinks in terms of helping people to engage faith and science.
Well, yeah.
And it was right when I moved from being a pastor to a professor. So I thought, my goodness. But I think, a lot of what we think and engage with is based on people we know that we trust. And so we need trusted voices to be out there. And that's like, nobody's going to doubt, I'm just assuming, we don't know each other personally, but from what I know about you, nobody's going to assume that you don't believe in the gospel. As you then talk about evolution or other biological insights that you have. And that's really I think that's really, really helpful. So I think it's partly we need to encourage our leaders, our Christian leaders in science, Christian leaders in the church, broadly speaking, the body of Christ is what I mean by that. We need to encourage these leaders to make a space for discussing issues of science and technology and how they inform our faith. So I think that's really important. There was when Barna did the study that came out as the book "You Lost Me." They found out that 52% of kids in youth groups, so Christian kids in youth groups, 52% will go into a science-related profession, not as a scientist per se, but where science is important. But only 1% of the youth groups that they surveyed talk about science and faith one time a year. And so we're just not taking the time as leaders in youth groups or in the church to say this is an important topic and this is something we need to discuss alongside other important topics, but certainly one that needs to be connected with.
Well, and it seems like you're involved in a bunch of that good work as well. Tell us about your work with the Dozier program and the Science and Congregations and some of the different groups that are working to train people in seminary and future pastors so that we can better dialogue in the future. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, I'm really excited about the great work that's being done. You mentioned Dozier is really amazing organization through the AAAS, as you mentioned, which is the largest scientific organization in the world. So Jennifer Wiseman, who's a leading astronomer, the head of the Hubble Space Telescope, guides that project along with her team and has done some wonderful work in connecting religion and science. It's a because it's it's not only about Christianity, but religion in general, but much of it does connect with us as Christians. And Jennifer is definitely a person of deep Christian faith. Biologos has been great. I think they do really good work, especially in the areas that you're a part of, and biology and origins. And just about anything Francis Collins says, who started Biologos, is worth paying attention to. He's just so good. And then Deb Harzma, who's the president, is an astronomer, and it's a powerful combination. Their history of engaging with evolution, and then some of the other work that they're doing as well. The work that we've done that I think it's been helpful. I think back to something you said earlier. I think some of these organizations have pushed the needle in a positive direction, where there's a public perception that faith and science are not incompatible and actually can be quite compatible. For us, with Science and Congregations, which, by the way, as we speak, we're rebranding and working our mission so it will morph into Science for the Church. But the idea behind Science and Congregations, or Science for the Church, is there are already scientists in congregations, so let's have them speak. Right? Isn't that true? So, back to what I was saying about you, I'm assuming you're in a congregation and whatever sort, let's have you talk about your science and what it means to you, and why you see the glory of God in the works of nature, and maybe even some of the struggles you have and some of the questions that science brings, or your form of science brings. Because it had a number of different effects. One is if this is worked out in a positive relationship, it being the discussion of science and faith, it's going to have just so much more impact. Our guard is let down. We're not defensive. We're not argumentative. It doesn't mean we'll always agree, but it means that we're going to be much more likely to learn, I think. And then I just think we have a lot of great Christians in the sciences today, but we're becoming less and have become less represented in the sciences than is the percent. There are more Christians in the United States than there are Christians in the sciences. And I want to be part of a movement that sees science as this is just a funny word, but it comes to mind as a legitimate Christian vocation, right?
Right. Yep.
It's strategic. It's part of what the gospel needs to do, how we need to move out with the gospel today.
Yeah.
And so, go ahead.
Elaine Eklund's book starts with that remarkable anecdote of, speaking with a woman who was so glad that her child wasn't going to Cornell because she was worried that they would be, influenced by the secular scientists there. And that's what I'm trying to push back against. I think you and your work are doing the same, that science is somehow going to distract us from our faith, and we want to promote the opposite. I think it actually can encourage a strengthened Christian faith. We just need to reframe the intersection. And so I really, really appreciate all the work that you've done in that direction.
Well, we're kind of doing it from different sides, right? You're doing it from the science side, I'm doing it from the theological side, and I think they're both important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're going to need both to work together to get something done, because as you mentioned earlier, and we see this, I have a colleague here at Northwestern who works in climate change education research, and he's found what won't surprise people, or won't surprise too many people, is that Christians are willing to ignore the conclusions of science if they come from a source that they just don't trust. Mm-hmm. Right? And so we need what I can't remember the term they use, but Catherine Hayhoe has talked about herself as a climate change evangelist, that she is out there being the Christian that you can trust, who got the same worldview, and I still see it that way as well. And so to what degree pastors can say, I see a role for science, and scientists can say, I see a role for religion, it just seems like we'll make progress.
Absolutely. That's key. I just think that's so important.
Yep.
We don't think about ideas in abstraction primarily. We think of them in relationships with people. And so like Catherine Hayhoe is amazing. The one thing I would say, Dale, that is part of the strategy, the long-term strategy, is Christians are highly underrepresented in the elite institutions, in any kind of religious person. But, like if you go to the Harvard, the Yales, et cetera, the Berkeleys, I'll put my alma mater in there.
Yeah, there you go. You should.
Yeah, and it's like, I'm not saying we need elite scientists. That's not my point, but we do need some elite scientists. And so we have to create an environment, continue to create a more friendly environment for people to study science as a Christian calling. And that's, I think, probably going to be one of our most important contributions. If we can do that, I think that's really, really helpful. And again, not everybody has to be an elite institution. I'm in a California State University. So, and I think the work that we do.
And I'm in a small school as well. Yours is probably bigger than mine, but different focus.
Yeah, totally. So, but anyway, I just think we need a few of those people. We need a few more Francis Collinses and Wisemans.
Yep, absolutely.
Because they do have a voice that is important.
Yeah, well, this has just been really helpful, Greg. Thanks so much for your time. Do you want to leave off with any other recommendations for resources, and or also just tell us how our listeners can get in touch with you or find your work, and tell us a little more about perhaps the book that you're about to publish.
Yeah. I'll give you a few little places to connect, because I do think this is an important topic. The first thing is, if you do want to just email me, that's easy. Greg, Greg, at Cootsona, which is COOTSONA.net. That's my email address. You're welcome to email me, and I'd be happy to point you in any direction. The ministry, the nonprofit that we have, we meaning me and my colleague Drew Rick Miller, is currently Science in Congregation. So scienceincongregation.org. Yeah, if you look that up, you'll find us. We are going to move into science for the church, but so probably by the time people hear this, you could use either of those.
Okay.
The book that you're talking about, Mere Science and Christian Faith, is particularly designed for this emerging adult demographic, 18 to 30-year-olds. It not only looks at why it's important to talk about science for 18 to 30-year-olds and the topics that I've found that people want to talk about, but also some of the strategies that you mentioned, that you asked about, as far as engaging endorsers, engaging people who are scientists and that sort of thing. The new book is Negotiating Science and Religion in America, and it's more of an academic book. That'll come out next month, I guess it'll be December 2019. I, of course, would love people to know more about that as well.
Yeah.
The Mere Science book is a little bit more user-friendly, I would say.
Yeah. Oh, that's
probably more. Yeah. Well, good. And thanks for taking time to look it over.
Yeah.
I mean, I think here's what I want to make sure everybody hears. I am concerned and interested and engaged and motivated by the topic of faith let's put it this way, by mere Christianity and mainstream science. Mere Christianity and mainstream science need to come together for the sake of the gospel.
Yep.
And it's not primarily an intellectual interest, although I certainly have that, it being the reconciliation of these two, but more of an interest of how can the church be strengthened strategically in a time where people are increasingly not going to go inside the walls of the church.
Yep.
So that's why I think this is important. I think the topics are important. I think the science is brilliant, that is being, is emerging today. But at the end of the day, it's about the gospel and what's going to help the church to be faithful to the call of Jesus Christ in the 21st century.
Well, I'm on board with that. I really appreciate your work. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I think we'll let you go, but thanks for your time.
Thanks, and thanks so much for letting me be part of your show. I appreciate it.
Sure. Thanks for listening to the Disciple Science Podcast. Disciple Science is a crowd-funded nonprofit that's exploring the intersection of faith and science. We believe that scientific understandings can inspire a strengthened Christian faith. We're hard at work on more podcasts, animated videos, and study guides, but we can't make them without your support. We'll make everything available free of charge in hopes that they'll help people like you who want to understand how science fits together with a meaningful relationship with Jesus. You can support the young artists that are making those videos right now by contributing to Disciple Science via the donate button on the disciplescience.com website. You can also help us by rating and sharing our videos and podcasts and telling your friends about Disciple Science. As always, thanks for listening.